Hello everyone, I'm Caroline Molloy. I'm the editor of openDemocracyUK, and I'd like to welcome you to Open Democracy's weekly live discussion. Open Democracy is an online media platform with a mission to challenge power and inspire change. And so thanks to everyone for joining us. We do want this conversation to involve all of you listening at home or wherever you are as much as possible. So particularly thank you to the quite significant number of people who've submitted questions and comments ahead of time, and we will try and address as many of these as we can. If you're joining us on Zoom, and if you have a question or comment that occurs to you as we're talking, you can click on the chat button at the bottom of your screen and type your question into the chat window, and I will keep my eye on those, as will my colleague. And if you're joining us from Facebook, you can also ask questions on there, and that will be fed back to me as well. So today we are discussing trade deals, and in particular the prospect of a US-UK deal and how that relates to Johnson's Brexit negotiating strategy and, as we put in the title, disaster capitalism. Johnson has said recently that leaving the EU at the end of this year without any kind of trade deal would be a good outcome. And it seems that even if we do get a deal with the EU, it will be just what they're calling a thin one, or what EU chief negotiator Michel Barnier calls a thin deal, a low-profile deal. So it begs a number of questions, I think, and I've been talking to Nick before this about what else is going on in the background, and in particular the UK-US deal. So yes, I'm joined by Nick Dearden. Nick is the director of Global Justice Now, an organisation campaigning on global trade issues. And Nick has been campaigning on trade for 20 years, I think, and has recently written a book called Trade Secrets: The Truth About the US Trade Deal and How We Can Stop It. And that book is available as a free ebook, and I think the link should be appearing in your chat. And it's very much worth a read. I was reading it earlier today myself. If you want the short version, Open Democracy has also just published an edited extract of that, and that link will also appear in your chat. So I'm just going to lots of people joining us from all across the country. That's lovely. I'm just going to start, Nick, by setting the scene a little bit, or asking you to set the scene a little bit. So Britain is currently in what some might say is the unenviable position of negotiating trade deals with both the EU, as we leave the EU, and with the US. So formal UK talks with the US on a trade deal with them began in May, I think, and we're into what I think is now the 9th round of trade talks with the EU at the end of this month. And obviously there's trade talks going on with other countries as well. We're hearing a lot about that from ministers. So Nick, could you maybe start by just telling us what are trade deals? I mean, is that even the right name for what's being discussed?
Thanks, Caroline. Yeah, and thanks for inviting me on. Yeah, that's part of the reason I wanted to write this very short book, because I think people have a lot of misconceptions about what trade deals are. I mean, either that they're just very boring and dry and technical, and indeed there is a lot of technical detail in there, or that, you know, as kind of left-wing activists, they're not really something we need to take too seriously. I mean, they're kind of about reducing tariffs, right? That's the traditional view of trade deals. They're about reducing the taxes paid on goods coming into the country, and therefore, you know, they may have been significant at some point in our past. They may be significant for some developing countries today, but between developed countries, like, who really cares? And so I wanted to write this to say, actually, what we regard as what are called trade deals and trade rules today actually encompass vast areas of the global economy. I mean, to some degree, they are the rules of globalization. And this set of rules is particularly advantageous and beneficial to big finance and big corporations, the big winners of globalization, at the expense of us, our democracy, our public services, our rights to decide on our own food standards. I mean, they just touch on so many different aspects of our lives. And that's why these negotiations are so important. It's not simply about, you know, will our businesses be able to have access to European markets, and on what terms after the transition period ends at the end of this year, as important as that may be. It's actually about how we regulate our economy and our society.
And I think, I mean, you mentioned, I think that point about regulation is really important to stress. And as you say, they're sort of setting the rules of the global economy. But I just wondered, having looked at your book about the US negotiation, could you maybe just tell us a little bit about how that book came about? Because you've got a lot of information in there. I said in the intro that the trade talks with the US started formally in May, but that wasn't really where they started, was it? I mean, we found some stuff out, but it hasn't been that easy to find stuff out, has it?
It's been very difficult. And again, this is one of the problems with trade deals, because although they affect massive parts of our regulation, and I can explain in a while, if you like, why they affect our regulations in such a fundamental way. But for now, let's accept that they do affect our regulations. And in fact, trade deals between developed countries particularly are about regulations rather than tariffs. So they're very, very important for all manners of standards and the government's ability to kind of rein in corporate power and the power of the market over our lives. And one of the really big problems is despite being so far-reaching, are that they're treated as international treaties. Essentially, these are international agreements, and what that means is our Parliament has far less ability to scrutinize these deals, can't even actually formally stop these deals because they're negotiated under royal prerogative. So they're both very far-reaching and have very little public and parliamentary scrutiny or accountability, which of course makes them a perfect vehicle for a government like this one to be able to change things. And so what we've seen is, yes, the formal negotiations, as you say, started this year because they weren't allowed to start before this year because of the rules of being a member of the European Union. But actually, they've been talking about this since shortly after the Brexit vote, and indeed before that. And many listeners tonight will probably remember the TTIP negotiations, and indeed this is how I kind of got into the US trade deal. We were fighting TTIP, which is the big trade deal between the European Union and the United States, which was proposed 6-7 years ago now, and was stopped by campaigners because they were so worried about it. And many things that we were worried about in the TTIP negotiations are there in the US trade deal. It's very similar. So they've been talking about this. I mean, to be honest, some of this stuff goes back to the late 90s. Big business, big finance has wanted to get some of the stuff in the US trade deal into international trade law since the late 90s. And that's why there was this outpouring of anger and concern at the way the WTO was working and what it was going to incorporate in its rules in the late 90s. And we brought that to a stop, and we brought many different individual trade deals that then said, okay, if we can't get it in the WTO, we will try and get this agreed as bilateral rules between different countries. Some of those trade deals went ahead, some of them were stopped, but in their modern incarnation, I would say TTIP was absolutely essential to a big business's attempts to put these things back on the agenda and bind governments and bind countries like our own. So yes, they've been on the table a fair while. And indeed, for a leader like Trump, I mean, this was absolutely what Brexit was all about for him. I mean, he's fundamentally interested in us taking on, not just buying more American stuff. I mean, that's not really what this is about, but taking on the American regulatory and economic model and moving Britain closer to the US orbit in that sense.
And what do you think, do you have a sense of, the core, I mean, as you say, this is such a wide-ranging area, but do you have a sense of, well, whether it's Trump or the people around Trump's core areas of concern? What are the areas of our economy, of our daily lives that they are really most keen to change through the mechanism of a trade deal and regulatory alignment, or whatever you want to call it?
I would say, as far as Trump's concerned, there's the big picture analysis, which is he sees two big competitors in the world, China and the European Union, and everything for him is a zero-sum game. I mean, he doesn't really understand trade that well. So everything is a kind of zero, it's like a business deal, basically. And I win, the more you lose. So it's all very zero sum for Trump. So Trump's personal interest is in weakening his biggest competitors, which is to say the European Union and China, and moving Britain out of the European sphere and closer to the American sphere. That's the game for him, and that's what he's interested in. But of course, behind Trump sit a lot of big business lobbyists and interests, and frankly, what they're pushing would be the same whether, even if Biden wins the election, they would be pushing for very similar stuff, and particularly what they're interested in is food standards. So no surprise that clawing chicken has become almost synonymous with the US trade deal, because it's a symbol of US food producers farming on an absolutely massive industrial scale with intensive use of chemicals, hormones, steroids, antibiotics, and all the rest of it. Animals kept in atrocious conditions in many instances, being very angry for a number of years that the food standards that we have here do not allow their produce to be imported into our markets. And so they say, and this is the way trade deals work, rather than thinking, okay, well, that's the democratic way that you've decided you're going to regulate your food standards. Trade deals simply see those standards as a barrier, as protectionism, as an obstacle to their ability to trade stuff, and therefore they need to be got rid of. And so that's how regulations become such a big part of trade deals today. From the perspective of American big agribusiness, our food standards are a massive problem, and they need to overcome that problem. And that is probably the number one thing driving the US negotiators. But there are a number of other areas as well. So big pharmaceutical corporations who are very unhappy about the fact that the NHS has some ability, in effect, to negotiate drug prices. They're still very high. It pays a lot of money for patented drugs. But we do have through NICE a public body, which can say, okay, that is just not value for money. We're not going to stock that drug. And Big Pharma absolutely hates that, because it means that they have to lower their prices if they want the NHS to stock it. So they want to get rid of that. So they're there as well. Obviously, we know that big American healthcare corporations want to have the right to bid for NHS contracts and so on. So that's kind of in there as well. And then I would say the final really big push from the American side is big tech. Amazon, Google, Facebook. I mean, these corporations that are, increasingly just the robber barons of our age. They have monopolized the use of certain technologies in our society. And we are only now beginning to wake up to just how much power that gives them almost over our souls, over our brains, right? And every aspect of our lives. And they are absolutely determined to embed a number of rules in international law that would make it extremely difficult, if not impossible, for us to levy proper taxation on them, or for us to be able to regulate the online harms that they are creating in our society.
I think, yeah, so food, pharma and health and tech, that was reflected in some of the questions we had as well, that those were people's sort of top concerns really, and we'll perhaps come back to some of those issues in a bit more detail shortly. I just noticed that we've had an interesting comment in the chat already from Liam Roach, who says, is the UK not already tied to the USA, given that the level of inequality shown in I don't know what he means by the WIR, but the level of inequality in the US and the UK is very similar in contrast to the rest of Europe. It's an interesting question. We do often have that sense on the left, don't we, that we're already far too akin to America in terms of workers' rights and various other areas. So, is there really going to be such a big change if the Americans get what they weigh? What are some of the key differences between the sort of going with the American kind of market approach and regulation approach and the European one, would you say?
There would be a massive change. And this is really interesting, right? Because for some of the people around Boris Johnson, like Liz Truss, the trade secretary, like Dominic Raab, like some of the real free marketeers around Johnson, the reason they wanted to leave the EU wasn't the reason that some of us might be skeptical about the EU, i.e. we think it does give in to big business interests a lot of the time. So that's not the reason they don't like it. They see it as an over-regulated, almost protectionist kind of economic bloc. And that's what they want to get rid of. They want to get out of that. They don't believe in standards or regulations as means by which governments can kind of protect us from the power of the unfettered market forces that they believe are the basis of a good society. And so, I mean, you know, one of the real benefits of the EU, as far as I can see, is that in certain areas they have raised standards over the years. Not in all areas, but in areas like, you know, for us, water quality was a really big thing, right? We had really dirty water when we entered the European Economic Community. But food, I mean, I think their food standards have by and large been successful. I'm not saying more couldn't be done. Of course it could. But it is such a massive contrast with the complete lack of regulation, the complete lack of government's ability to be able to protect citizen safety and welfare, even if they wanted to. And, you know, we've talked about food a lot as the campaigns proceeded. But I mean, one area that when I was writing the book, I started looking into a little bit was cosmetics. It's absolutely phenomenal just how unregulated the American cosmetics industry is. I mean, the regulations are based on stuff that was brought in the 1930s, and the regulator really has no more power than they had at that time. And so they routinely include stuff like formaldehyde in nail products and hair products, stuff that we don't use at the moment because we think it's too dangerous. And even, I mean, the most extreme example, which is just extraordinary, is in makeup marketed at kids in some of the high street shops in the US. They found asbestos, which is mined as part of, you know, mining talc, and if you don't regulate it properly, it can easily get in there. And the regulator said, you know, put out a statement saying, well, this isn't very good. We don't recommend you buy this, but they couldn't remove the stuff from supermarket shelves. They just don't have that power. So the power of the regulator is vastly reduced in many cases in the US, and this all comes back to the basis of regulation. So here in Britain we have the precautionary principle at the moment, which is it takes a cautious approach to new products and new technologies. It's not against them, but it says
it's an EU principle, isn't it? The precautionary comes derives from the EU. That's the attitude. Sorry to interrupt. But yeah.
That's right. So it kind of says, let's look at the harm that this might cause, like across the, for example, if you're doing a meat production, from the minute that the animal is born to the minute that it's on your plate, if you like. Let's look at various harms that could occur along the way, and let's try and minimize them at every point. The American system is entirely different. I mean, they call it science-based, right? But what they really mean by that is, unless you can prove some serious harm has happened to you through consuming this product, it's allowed to be on the shelves. And of course, as an individual consumer, it can be incredibly difficult to prove harm. So they basically say, whatever a company can come up with to make their products more efficient is okay. Right? It's okay unless someone dies or some serious harm is caused by this product. And that means genetic modification is like one of the really big things that we haven't spoken about a lot up to now in the campaigning against the US trade deal, but it's something Boris Johnson wants. I mean, he actively wants this. So the idea that he's going to be holding out in a US trade deal against big business interests from the United States who are saying, you know, we want you to allow this stuff into your markets. He's not, because he thinks we should have it as well. So, I mean, what the real worry here is, you've got big business interests saying what they've always said on the American side. But when we had the EU negotiating for us, although there were real concerns, by and large, they were pushed by countries like France, for example, who were really keen to keep this stuff out of our markets. When you've got Liz Truss negotiating for you, she wants this stuff in our market. She wants to change standards here. And so people like that see the US trade deal as a perfect vehicle for that form of deregulation.
I mean, but the thing I always remember about Liz Truss is her suggesting that, you know, freedom was defined as being able to ride an Uber or something like that. So yes, I'm not. If she's the one in charge of our negotiation, it is slightly worrying. And as you say, the onus is very much in the so-called science-based model. In other words, the not precautionary model. The onus is very much on the consumer, the citizen, to prove that harm has occurred, rather than starting to, as I understand science, certainly medical science, it it really ought to start from principle of, you know, first do no harm, the kind of famous Hippocratic principle. Let's and you know, and it's sort of turning that on its head, which I think, as you say, is a sort of principle underlying a lot of the kind of regulatory difference. I mean, people are obviously pushing back against, you know, there obviously has been a lot of concerns, particularly on the area of food, although, as I say, it extends into many other areas, cosmetics and pharma as well. One of the questions which had just popped up in the chat, and I guess it sort of ties into some of the stuff around, there's also questions coming in about the democratic process of all of this and how we can stop it. So one of the questions I've just seen in the chat is, so the House of Lords, I think as part of the agriculture bill a few days ago, voted basically that there should be no dilution of domestic food standards. Does that, so are we okay now then?
We're not, although I'm very pleased that they've passed that amendment. But we're not okay because the amendment is not yet law. And there are two bills going through Parliament at the moment that are really important for us. One is the agriculture bill, which obviously deals with the food standards bit of it. The other is the trade bill. And in both of them, we have MPs and Lords who are trying to put down amendments to protect, for example, the NHS, as well as protect our food standards, as well as just give themselves some power over trade deals when they're being negotiated. Because as things stand, the government has transferred over the ability for Britain to be able to negotiate its own trade deals from the European Union, but they haven't transferred over any of the democratic scrutiny processes that the European Union has to allow members of the European Parliament, for example, or members of the member state parliaments to see the negotiating papers of these trade deals. Our MPs are not allowed to do that, so they can't really scrutinise this stuff properly. They're not allowed to stop a trade deal. They're not allowed, they have no automatic right to get a debate even on the government's negotiating objectives before they launch a trade deal. It's all dealt with by royal prerogative. So, you know, in the name of the Queen, our negotiators go off and negotiate an international treaty, and our MPs have virtually no power over it. I mean, it's absolutely extraordinary. Given that, you know, people were told we're leaving the European Union because we want our sovereignty back, and parliamentary sovereignty was a really important part of that, that if we do ever get to the point where we have an EU-UK trade deal, while members of the European Parliament will get a vote on that, and it may well be the case that members of the Greek Parliament get a vote on that, and even members of Belgian regional assemblies get a vote on that, our own MPs at Westminster have no right or ability to stop that trade deal. So that's what taking power back looks like for the Johnson government. It's really shocking. So these two bills are going through Parliament at the moment. MPs and Lords are trying to take back some power for themselves, but also protect the areas that they're particularly worried about. But the problem is MPs have rejected all amendments so far. It is in the Lords. The Lords have passed this amendment. They are likely to pass more amendments in the coming 2 weeks. They then have to go back to the House of Commons, and MPs can simply remove them again. So, of course, when it comes to that, we will be putting, you know, as much pressure as we can on MPs not to do that. It's really interesting, I think, given we have a government with a 80-seat majority, that there have been rebellions in the House of Commons, and all those rebellions have been on trade deals. So, you know, it gives you an understanding of how important this stuff is. However, the rebellions have not so far been enough to overturn that majority. So we will see what happens when it comes back. That they are very, very important, but you know, if we are unable to get to a point where Parliament has the ability to protect us from these trade deals and to stop trade deals if necessary, the only option we've got is to throw everything into campaigning to stop these deals full stop, because we have no other ability to influence what's going to be in them.
So if I understand correctly, because it's quite complicated, there's the agriculture bill, you know, which MPs, okay, given there's an 80-seat majority and it'll go back to the Commons, we'll see what happens there. So there is some legislation on areas of regulation like food, which is going through, which MPs do have a vote on. But if I understand you correctly, what you're saying is that unlike MEPs in the European Parliament who have a vote on trade deals, and indeed in their domestic legislatures in Europe as well, and I think unlike Congress in America, who also have a vote on trade deals.
That's right.
That actually, on the actual trade deal itself, British MPs, as it stands, have no vote. I mean,
that's correct. I mean, they may get a vote if the government gives them one,
right?
But they're not guaranteed one. And even if they reject the trade deal, it doesn't matter. I mean, the government just has to bring it back like 21 days later and try again and try again and try again. And that's if they give them a vote and a debate. And by the way, they will probably already have implemented the trade deal by the time that vote happens in any case, because they have the power to do that.
I mean,
so
how is this a democracy? How is this? This is really extraordinary. I mean, I thought I'd kind of thought about this trade stuff, but actually really grappling with that point, you know, how have we as a democracy got to that stage where we're in that? Is it because we haven't had to negotiate trade deals for quite a long time because the Europe's been doing that for us? Is that why we're in such a mess?
Basically, yeah. So you know, when the EU started negotiating trade deals on our behalf, if you like, you know, MEPs there didn't have very much power either. But you see, what happened in trade is, and I would argue trade's always been important. It's always been about, I mean, you know, we live in a country that made its wealth trading people, right? We bombarded Chinese ports and forced them to trade opium with us. Right? I mean, the history of free trade is not a pretty one. But something really big and different happened in the late 90s after the WTO was formed. And that's really that trade at that point became about so much more than tariffs. As I say, tariffs are important in some circumstances, but at that point, trade rules came to encompass all these other areas that we're talking about today, you know, how you regulate your public services, intellectual property on medicines, food regulations, all this other stuff kind of became in and there was a good reason for that, you know, big business said, well, if we want to get something enforced in international law, in the global economy, then put it in a trade deal, because trade deal has that weight, has that authority. But because we weren't negotiating our own trade deals at the time, there wasn't much push for democracy from, you know, towards the British government and how they get to negotiate trade deals. All of that effort was put into the European Union. And there were significant improvements, especially around the TTIP time, in the amount of power the European Parliament had to hold the Commission to account for the trade deals that it was negotiating. At that time, it got the power to stop trade deals. It got the power to see the negotiating papers and so on. But yeah, I mean, because we haven't been through that as ourselves with our own government doing the negotiations, if you like, none of that stuff, it's all passed them by. And so essentially they've taken on a parliamentary scrutiny method of negotiating trade deals, which is from the 1920s. I mean, it hasn't been updated since then.
So MPs don't get to vote on a deal, so it's up to us basically as citizens to stop this, or to stop the worst elements of it. Just kind of I'm jumping around a bit here, but just, you know, thinking about what this actually means in practice. So, and the kind of democracy that the extent to which democracy is completely overwritten. So if if we sign this trade deal with America, and then, I don't know, let's imagine that in a few years' time we get elected a more left-wing government that decides that it wants to renationalise the Royal Mail or renationalise large elements of the NHS, and, you know, it will pass legislation to do so in Parliament, and it can do that, or it can't do that in the future.
It depends how it does it, and that's really the thing. It can do certain things, but if it is violating a trade agreement, then there will be consequences for that. And some of those consequences will be state to state. Some of the consequences will be directly from the American government, who would say you're violating your contract here, and we can impose sanctions on you, or whatever it may be for that. But there's a really unpleasant aspect, a particularly unpleasant aspect to modern trade deals, which is increasingly they give big business itself the ability to take a government to task when it violates, in their view, any aspect of a trade deal. And this is called, we call it the corporate court system. It's actually called ISDS, or Investor State Dispute Settlement System. And it's almost like a parallel court, a parallel legal system within a trade agreement. And what it means is that in the case of a US-UK deal, American big business could directly and in secret sue the British government for treating said business unfairly. And the definition of what unfairly means has been expanded by city law firms over the last 15 years to an almost ludicrous degree. So treating a big business unfairly is virtually any form of regulation, essentially. There have been cases, because these things already exist. I mean, this isn't some conspiracy theory. These things already exist in deals that we've got, but they're mostly with deals we've got with developing countries. So mostly, apart from Canada, because Canada has a deal with the US in the form of NAFTA, so Canada has been sued a lot by big business in a way that we surely would be under a US trade deal. Countries have been sued for all sorts of things, like putting health warnings on cigarette packages or putting cigarettes in plain packages, like increasing the minimum wage of workers in the water industry when a privatized company had taken over that industry, like renationalizing health insurance. That was one against Slovakia, and I mean, the Netherlands is being sued at the moment because it's trying to phase out coal-fired power stations by 2030. And a coal company is suing them for that. And this all happens in secret courts. We have no right to go to these courts. Governments have no right of appeal. There's nothing they can do. They can try and defend themselves and win the case. But if they don't, they have to pay out. And you can imagine that puts a huge regulatory chill on the government's willingness to take on some of this stuff. So, I mean, a relevant example here is you mentioned taking parts of the now privatized industries back into public ownership. Well, we know in the last election, Labour promised to do that with the energy sector. A couple of energy companies before the election set up subsidiaries overseas in countries that we currently have investment deals with ISDS with, on the basis that they could sue the Labour government if they'd come in and tried to do that and not given them what they would regard as adequate compensation. So they were ready to do it.
So you mean, if I understand, they moved abroad because this only works when it's foreign investors suing us, like they have to be based somewhere else. So they moved abroad, British energy companies, so that if they were renationalised, they could sue the British government, the Corbyn government.
Precisely, that's precisely so. Now, at the moment, we have those kind of deals with a number of developing countries, as I've already said. We don't have that mechanism with the United States. The United States is the country where most multinational corporations are based. So this would open us up to being sued by thousands, potentially, of multinational corporations whenever we passed a regulation that effectively said multinational didn't like.
I think we had a question in the comments earlier, a question that was submitted in advance, which was maybe relevant to this. So yeah, Neville Rigby asked, does our desperation to enlarge global trade undermine our commitments to combat climate change? I'm kind of aware that there's been quite a few of these nasty investor court things around climate change, hasn't there?
Very much. It does. I mean, look, at the moment, we should all be getting ready to go up to Glasgow for COP if it wasn't for the pandemic.
For the UN climate talk, yeah.
That's right. Hopefully, we will be able to do that next year. But one of the things I'm continually saying when we're talking about the environment and climate change is governments cannot take the actions that they need to take to deal with climate change under the current trade regime. Yes, as Neville says, that's partly because, of course, the more stuff you're producing and transporting around the world, the more carbon emissions you've got. I mean, okay, you can conceive of doing it with renewable energy and so on, but we're nowhere near that at the moment. So trade in and of itself, the endless liberalization and growth of trade is a problem in and of itself. But then there are all sorts of other aspects to trade deals today that are even more of a problem than that, because what trade deals do in a nutshell is tie the hands of governments, is prevent governments acting against the free flow of trade. And what that really means today, because so much trade is captured by big business, it essentially means tying governments' hands to regulate big business in various ways that they don't like. And so when it comes to climate change, the food stuff obviously relates to that, because industrial agriculture has a massive impact on the amount of carbon emissions we're producing. So if there's more industrial agriculture, as there would be under a US-UK trade deal, that's bad for the climate. But it gets even worse than that. In some modern trade deals, and we don't know if this would be in a US trade deal or not at the moment, but in some modern trade deals, there are things called energy neutrality clauses that essentially make it almost impossible for governments to discriminate between different sources of energy. Well, we absolutely need to do that. We can't possibly tolerate this kind of stuff, because it's getting in the way of us doing the stuff that's already incredibly difficult to do, but we urgently need to do it. You know, there is stuff in the preliminary deal that Trump signed with China, the preliminary trade deal he signed with China. There is stuff in the NAFTA agreement that basically says you can't not export a certain proportion of different energy sources to the country that you're trading with. It's there in the trade deal. So Canada, it's in the trade, you know, has a duty to export a proportion of its tar sands into the United States under the NAFTA deal. Right? So it is trying to create a global energy market. And that's where this is all going, to create a global energy market that will ensure the free flow of energy sources around the world. We just can't do that. And so in very, very direct ways, trade deals are getting in the way of our ability to deal with climate change. And as you say, absolutely rightly, that yes, a number of these ISDS cases have been, well, like the one against the Netherlands at the moment, have been a direct challenge to a government's ability to take action on climate change, you know, under the Paris Agreement.
Mm. And then we don't get to sue them in these secretive courts, do we? And I think I also read in your paper something about, you know, actually, you know, there's this sort of imbalance between like these new systems which Britain hasn't been so exposed to, like, you know, vis-a-vis the US in the past. We've maybe been the big bad in these courts in the past, but you know, now if we face the prospect of being exposed to them, our government can be sued by corporate interest. And indeed, I've seen Open Democracy publish a story recently about the spectre of governments being sued for their coronavirus measures, which have, of course, in some cases impinged on business profits, on aviation profits or whatever. And I think, you know, with the climate stuff, one of the things you wrote about that I read, which I thought was really interesting, was although, you know, there's been a lot of pushback about these investor courts, and you know, that was a particular feature of TTIP, I think, that there's been sort of like, you can see the special pleading from the lobbyists coming into play as our democracy isn't really functioning in relation to it. So I think it was that there's been some changes, but actually oil companies have got some special privileges within these courts even, or something like that. But I mean, it's all kind of terrifying. I've just noticed a really interesting question here, which we've heard a lot in the last few days, haven't we, about international law and our obligations under international law, with the government saying that it was going to be entitled to break it. And indeed, I heard one of the government ministers, I can't remember who, on the radio the other day saying, well, but, you know, people break international law all the time. The World Trade Organization breaks international, the EU breaks World Trade Organization rules, she said, and that's arguably international law. And someone's asked in the questions, what would happen if our obligations under the trade deal clashed with our obligations under the Sustainable Development Goals? Surely both of these are a sort of international law. I mean,
that's a really good question, and it's a really good question. And one of the problems is with trade deals at the moment. In fact, I think that's absolutely right. Basically, what we should do is say all the stuff we really like and want governments to take action on, their international obligations for the climate and for human rights and whatever, we should put something at the beginning of trade deals to basically say these override anything else in this. Nothing in this trade deal will violate a government's responsibilities and obligations under this, but they don't. And so when you're talking, for example, about the secret courts, the corporate court system, the arbitrators in those cases, who are all corporate lawyers, have no obligation. I don't even think they have a right to take any other form of international law into account other than international investment law. That's all they take into account. So, I mean, there was a case in Canada where they got sued. The Canadian government had done an environmental impact assessment on a quarry that was going to be established in the country, and after the assessment, they found it was actually going to have a devastating impact both on indigenous people in the area and on the natural habitats and so on. And so they said, okay, we're going to scrap it. Well, the company that was involved in trying to set up the quarry took a case, and the arbitrators ruled, and this is an interesting case because there was actually a difference of opinion between the arbitrators, and there was a dissenting arbitrator. They ruled in favor of the company, but the dissenting arbitrator said, really? Have you really thought about this? I mean, because part of the company's case was simply instituting the environmental impact assessment was itself a breach of the investor agreement. the dissenting arbitrator said, hang on a minute, this is an absolute, this would put an absolute chill on any government's ability and willingness to even take the environment into account when it's doing this kind of stuff. Like you're even saying, like, just trying to think about this stuff is a problem and is in violation of investment law. And that's the problem. It takes, it's what trade and investment deals do. They take a very narrow bit of the law, which is really all about property rights, and they elevate that as if it's the only thing that matters. And that's how they've become these kind of corporate charters, really. I mean, anything that gets in the way of capital being able to go where it wants, when it wants, in the way that it wants, is a problem. And trade and investment laws are about trying to remove those problems and those obstacles. But we need to put obstacles in the way of capital going where it wants to do whatever it wants.
Absolutely. So if on the one hand, from what you're describing so eloquently, we've got a bunch of business lobbying interests and corporate lawyers taking a very narrow view of what is important in the world, basically, then all the more reason for democratic scrutiny, I suppose. And there's a bunch of questions coming in the column. Someone was asking about FOI. Someone's asked, John Solway's asked, about freedom of information. Does that not work in this stuff? And someone relatedly has asked, is there some kind of legal duty on the state to ensure that the secret process stays under wraps? I wanted to pick that out because I was quite horrified to learn that not only do we appear to not have any, right to see the negotiating mandate and the process of the negotiations whilst they're going on, which, you could say, well, it's a trading thing and it's trade-offs, and you can to some extent understand why they have to play their cards close to their chest, as they say. But I think I read somewhere recently that, maybe it was in your book, that not only do we not know what's going on as it happens, but we won't even be able to see the negotiating documents for like 5 years afterwards. They'll be sealed or something. So
5 years after it's implemented. 5 years after it's implemented, we won't be able to see them. I mean, it's extraordinary. We've signed that agreement.
Is that something that the Americans? Is that something the Americans have asked for, that level of secrecy, or is that something we?
Well, it's an interesting question. We're not quite sure because it's kind of secret, but I assumed it was, but maybe not. And this goes to the question about the freedom of information stuff, which I'm so pleased someone's asked that, because we've been taking the government to task for this for a long time. So way back, I think it was about 2 years ago, we asked for some details of who the government was discussing trade with, and what they were discussing, what was on the table, the agendas, and how often the working groups met, and so on. And they came back with nothing at all, nothing. And we appealed. And on appeal, they gave us all of these. I was very excited to get all this paper, and I thought, oh great, we're going to find out some stuff here. And virtually the whole lot was blacked out. It was redacted. And you will remember last year in the leaders' debate when Jeremy Corbyn held up these blacked out papers. They were the papers that we'd got out of the government. Now subsequently they were leaked, but or some of them were leaked. The ones with regard to the US were leaked. But on the day of the election, we actually launched our court case against the government, and we said it cannot be right that you will not give us this information. We've had a ruling back actually after the book was completed, so it's not in there, just a week ago, and the Information Tribunal has said they have to give us more information, but they have still retained a whole range of exemptions, basically saying when it comes to international trade deals, we accept that some of this stuff might have a negative impact on our relationship with foreign states or with businesses or whatever, and therefore the government has enormous leeway not to answer freedom of information requests. So we're thinking at the moment about potentially appealing this, because the thing we're saying is this goes to the heart of public policy, and therefore there is a strong public interest in knowing whether the government's sticking to its word and what they're prepared to give away on our behalf. One of the interesting things about that trial was the government barrister let slip at one point that there were negotiations going, because we more or less knew who they were talking to. We just didn't know how serious it was, how often they'd been negotiated. We had no real detail. However, it turns out there were negotiations so secret that we weren't even allowed to know who they were talking to. So they were talking to some government somewhere about trade deals, and it was so sensitive that the public can't even know we're talking. to them. I mean, just an extraordinary level of a lack of transparency and opacity around this stuff.
And meanwhile, they do seem to be playing, the British negotiators, both with the US and the EU, seem to be playing a very complicated game here. I think, I saw them saying that the strategy was, well, if we get a great deal with the US, then that increases our leverage with the EU. But, I think, it seems quite widely reported. I mean, maybe I'm going to take a step back here and say, do we really need to worry that much about a US trade deal? Aren't we being told that Trump isn't really into globalization, that Trump isn't really into trade deals, that and also I think that both sides are now really, although last year they said, oh, we're going to have some kind of UK-US trade deal wrapped up by July. Now they're saying there's no way that there's going to be anything done before the US election, or maybe just a mini deal that doesn't have to go through Congress. So I don't know. Maybe, is it still scary?
Well, I think it is scary because I mean, the thing is, trade deals do take a long time. You're completely right there. But they take a long time because normally both sides have quite strong interests that they're negotiating. If our own government doesn't really mind some of this stuff, then you can get a trade deal done very quickly. I mean, if they're just going to give in to whatever the other side wants, then you could do it quite quickly. And on some things, as I say, I think that they see absolutely eye to eye with the US administration, far more than they see the rationale for retaining some of the regulation and protections that we've got at the moment. So that makes me scared. It's true, Trump has some strange views on trade, but on this one he does want it, and he wants it both because, as I say, he wants to prize Britain away from the European Union's regulatory orbit, and because, frankly, he just wants to show he can do a good deal. And if he could do that before the election, great. Now, I don't think we're going to get a completely comprehensive deal covering all of this stuff that we've talked about tonight before the US election, although there was a report from yesterday I saw saying they were nearly ready to sign off several chapters. So that's worrying. I mean, part of this goes back to we just don't know. We just don't know how far they are on some of this stuff. But they might do a mini deal that includes some of this stuff, and that in and of itself could be problematic. So there's a report out just before we started the call on Reuters tonight saying the US is absolutely determined that the government will have to drop the digital services tax if it's to get a trade deal. So that's one of the things it's been really clear on. So digital services tax is the thing they've levied on the Silicon Valley corporations. It hasn't actually been collected or gone into formal effect yet because it's so bloody hard to tax big tech, right? So they've and we know that they're making an absolute killing at the moment. So we need to tax them. The US is saying absolutely you cannot do that. So could that be one of the things that they get dropped? Could there be a few things that strategically are really bad actually, and would tie our government's hands into the foreseeable future? Yeah, it's possible. It's possible. So I do think I do think we've got to be worried about it. But I do also think we have every chance of stopping it. And that's, I suppose, the thing that, well, maybe you want me to go into this, maybe you don't. But it is frightening. It's a really frightening conversation. And trade deals are often scary. And that's one way you win. You can win the campaigns because people are really alarmed by some of this stuff, understandably. But I do believe on this one we can win it, and I believe that because actually it's not just the NHS campaigners that are passionate about this. They are, and they're right to be, and that's brilliant. It's because we have some quite unusual allies on this. So farmers don't often join our campaigns. On this one, the farmers are really, really angry. The day George Eustice became the agricultural secretary, he was booed by a group of farmers just for mentioning the US trade deal. They are making a right nuisance of themselves all around the Tory shires, in their local newspapers, towards their local MPs. That's why there's been rebellions in Parliament on the agriculture bill, for example. That's great.
Can I just interrupt you on that, Nick? Because I think your point about alliances is really key, and this isn't an area that America's going to find easy to back down on, is it? I mean, the farmers are an absolutely key part of whether it's Trump's constituency or whoever ends up being president, right? So that's going to be a clash point to really watch out for, I suppose, and develop.
Massively. And that's why, I mean, I don't read it, but the Daily Mail is running regular articles against this trade deal, because it says, you know, the impact this will have on our farmers and our food will be absolutely disastrous. We just can't do this. So, I mean, fascinating, right? How often do you get to something like that happen? And there's been some really interesting research done. So by a group called Unchecked, and it's been doing some work in the red wall seats, in the former red wall seats in the north of England. And they've been talking to especially young Leave voters. Very interesting. Some of the stuff that these people are saying, you'd expect. You know, very not keen on migration, for example, you know, fairly conservative on law and order issues, as you might expect. However, when it comes to talking about animal welfare regulation, even environmental regulation, they love it. They absolutely love it. And this is really interesting, because I think it exposes a serious tension, a fundamental flaw at the heart of the Brexit alliance, that those of us who tried to campaign against it were never able to expose that tension as long as we were talking about the EU. But as soon as you stop talking about EU regulations and you start talking about British regulations, and of course they are British regulations, and even more so now, people are very defensive of, people like them. People think we're quite a leader in some of these fields. And I think what that goes to show me is, you know, there are a lot of people who voted Brexit, not because they want to become a free market, you know, Singapore on Thames, but because they actually want more security and more protection in their lives. And that fundamentally conflicts with what the leaders of the Leave campaign wanted from leaving the European Union. And I think the more we can do to expose that, the more we can have a real debate that gets beyond some of the culture wars stuff and actually looks at what kind of country we want to build.
And on workers' rights too, I imagine. I don't know, did the survey ask people about, because that's affected by all of this as well, potentially, right? That could also be considered a restriction on someone's future profits that they could be sued for, if I understand correctly. Is that right?
Well, I mean, it is certainly the case that we are going to be competing against goods and services produced by people with far lower rights. And of course, that has an impact on how competitive we are and how sustainable our rights in this country are. And I found it just mind-boggling that in the government's own assessment of this trade deal, they basically said American workers' rights are the same as ours. I mean, nothing to worry about.
What, was like zero holiday rights and whatever?
Yeah, it's just completely untrue. And so, you know, if that's what, I mean, I don't know whether they think that or you know, they're just misleading us, or they've not looked into it properly, or whatever it is. But for goodness sake, if you're actually going into this trade deal believing that we have the same workers' rights standards, you know, Americans have this day in I don't know, in like September or something, where they celebrate that they've already they've already worked a European year, you know, because they work so many more hours than Europe, because they have so few rights. Yeah,
we've just about to run out of time, but I just want to get one last question in, because it's quite a sort of pertinent one, I think, which is Andy Pye says, won't the US trade deal be blocked by Pelosi in Congress? We've heard, haven't we, a lot of concern from American lawmakers about the Good Friday Agreement and how, you know, what the Britain's games it's playing with that. Can we rely on Pelosi?
That's a really interesting question. I wouldn't rely on her, but it's certainly an interesting potential spanner in the works that I welcome. Who knows what's actually going to happen, and I suspect it will depend very, very much on what the government negotiates with the EU, which, as I say, I think is going to be a very small trade. I don't think they want no trade deal, but I think they want a very bare bones trade deal.
Well, it's not going to cover services, is it, for a start? It's not
exactly. So one of the questions is whether they can square the circle of how the hell you can have a completely different regulatory framework in the same country, and whether you can avoid that border across Ireland, which, you know, I don't think they can, but, you know, let's see. But that is the American Congress's big concern, and if they go ahead with this whole internal market bill thing and actually, you know, trigger a breach of international law, at that point I think it will be very difficult for them. And you know, there are all sorts of tensions, you know, inherent in negotiations like this, which will be very difficult for them to navigate. And again, that gives me a little bit of hope, because it was those tensions in TTIP that we managed to exploit and kind of gunge up the process to such an extent that it just wasn't really possible for it to go forward anymore.
So I think, I mean, some glimmers of light, but I mean, a lot of people asking in the chat and in advance, well, two things. One is a lot of people asking, saying they're finding this conversation really useful, which I'm really glad, and a big thanks to Nick for this. And this conversation will be available online. The recording should be on our YouTube, Open Democracy's YouTube channel, and on our social media accounts tomorrow. So watch out for that. But Nick, I just wanted to, you know, if you wanted to leave people, apart from you know, watching and digesting the chat here, if you wanted to leave people with a message of what is the thing that we as citizens can do, particularly given what we were saying earlier about the lack of democracy in this process, what are the main things that you would urge people to do at this stage?
So first of all, you know, obviously sign up on our website, Global Justice Now. You can get regular updates on this. You can get the book for free. And we're planning some kind of day of action on the 24th of October. That's the next. We're trying to do it in a safe way as possible, which means we're a bit late getting the message out. Of course, we would like to not be protesting at all at this time, but if the government is insisting that it's going to go ahead and ratify this thing, we have to be able to put up some resistance. So keep an eye on that. But last word, I would just say, don't despair of this at all. I know it's frightening stuff, but I honestly think these are dark times, and there's loads of stuff where you're like, oh God, how are we going to manage it? This is one thing I think we actually can defeat. And by defeating it, I think we open up a huge discussion about what kind of country we are going to become post-Brexit. And, you know, those of us on the left, those of us on the progressive side of the spectrum, we need to be a big part of that if we want to influence it.
And I think I love your point that it's actually a chance of a unifying discussion, and a discussion that sort of cuts across some of those, the Brexit divisions and the divisions between North and South and stuff. So yeah, I'm heartened by that as well. And so I'm just going to have to wrap it up there because we're rapidly running out of time. But thank you so much, Nick, and thank you so much to everybody for being such active participants in the debate. I'm sorry we didn't get to ask everybody's questions, but do, as I say, look online. This debate will be available on our YouTube site and our social media site. We have one of these debates every week. I'm sure we will be returning to the subject of trade at some point in the not too distant future. So check out our website and our social media for the details of our upcoming discussions. That link should be posted in the chat now as well. We also have a weekly newsletter, which you can sign up for. Hopefully that link is there too. And lastly, just to say that Open Democracy does rely on reader contributions and viewer contributions and donations. So if you want to see more public interest journalism like this, please do support Open Democracy, and you can support us using the link in the chat. And with that, I'm going to say thank you all. Thank you so much, Nick. I've really enjoyed chatting to you.
It's a pleasure.
Yeah, onwards and upwards, and see some of you viewers next week. Bye bye now.